As the conflict between Israel and the terrorist organization Hamas escalates, a curious contrast has been struck here at home. On the one hand, Republican politicians are cynically, dishonestly, and hypocritically criticizing President Biden, with one of their leaders actually openly admitting that it would be a great opportunity to hurt him politically. But on the other hand, the family members and loved ones of those actually targeted by Hamas are encouraging the president and reiterating their faith in him. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. All right, so here's the situation. The ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas probably isn't going to end anytime soon. And it's an inherent tragedy, especially when you consider the sheer scale of Israeli and Palestinian civilian deaths. All right, but it also illuminates problematic things back here at home, particularly the utter lack of principle and the utter shamelessness which animates the Republican Party. So I want to play a couple of clips here. One of them is from a Republican, or about a Republican, Ronna McDaniel, who is Mitt Romney's niece, but is very different from her uncle because he's at least somewhat principled and she is absolutely not. But she's in charge of getting Republicans elected as the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee. This is what she has to say. This is how she describes the conflict between Israel and Hamas.
I think this is a great opportunity for our candidates to contrast where Republicans have stood with Israel time and time again, and Joe Biden has been weak.
So she describes it as a great opportunity for Republicans to show how President Biden has been weak. Interesting. Then you contrast it with the words of those who or at least whose loved ones and family members have been actually targeted by Hamas. Now, I actually want to draw your attention to two parents in particular. Their son, Hirsch Goldberg Poland, is a man who moved to Israel back in 2008, and he was attending the Supernova Music Festival. And he was one of the many who were targeted by Hamas. According to reports, he has been kidnapped. At the time of this discussion, as far as we know, he's still alive at the time of this recording. But he also reportedly had his arm severed, blown off during the attack. So just an absolute tragedy. But this is what his parents had to say, in contrast to what Ronna McDaniel had to say.
Well, I truly feel that the American government, that President Biden and the State Department are working tirelessly, any angle that they can, to ensure that these American civilians who are being held hostage are freed, taken care of.
So, to me, the contrast just couldn't be more profound because as far as we know, and maybe I'm wrong, Ronna McDaniel has no affiliation with anything going on in Israel. She has no loved ones who are there, who have been targeted. She has no direct connection to it other than politics, again, as far as I know. And then you have Rachel and John, who are the parents of a young man who has been critically injured and kidnapped by this terrorist group, probably experiencing the absolute peak of human stress. They're terrified out of their mind. And yet, rather than try to undermine the president, they're actually encouraging him. They're reiterating their faith in him. This is the contrast. And the reason that it's so important to illuminate is because, listen, I don't believe in uncritical support of a president. Joe Biden is not perfect. Joe Biden never was perfect. Joe Biden never will be perfect. No president ever has been or ever shall be perfect. The frustrating thing, though, is that when it's a Republican in the White House, Republicans demand uncritical national unity and bipartisan support. As I've talked about, as I wrote in an article on Luke Beasley's website, as others have commented on social media, when President Bush was president after 9/11, of course Democrats didn't like it. Many of them actually thought he should not have been president given, what happened in the Florida recounts. And he was in charge during 9/11, and that was a domestic situation. Like, that was a terrorist attack against the United States, not just against an ally. You could have easily made the argument that, hey, that should have never happened. That happened on George W. Bush's watch. Why didn't he prevent it? And yet Republicans at the time said, well, you can't ask those questions. You can't talk about that. You can't criticize him right now because that would actually weaken national security, to criticize the sitting president. You have to wave the American flag. You have to show your patriotism. And Democrat, Republican, independent, liberal, conservative, it doesn't matter. You unite behind the president. That was the standard. But apparently that standard doesn't apply to a crisis when a Democratic president is in charge. And that just doesn't work for me. Again, the contrast, you have parents whose son is in mortal danger, and despite the stakes, despite the stress, they are encouraging President Biden, whereas Republicans are looking to cynically attack him politically. You have Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump, Tim Scott, Nikki Haley, Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, various Republicans, Steve Scalise, Republican politicians, not tweeting out encouragement to President Biden or a gesture towards bipartisanship, but taking every opportunity to try to undermine him, or even indicate, some of them imply, but some of them actually go one step further and just explicitly say that Biden is complicit in the attacks. It's an absolutely despicable and disgraceful double standard. It has no place in modern politics, and it's important that you and I flatly, firmly, completely reject it and demand that Republicans pick a standard that works for Republicans and Democrats and stick to it. We need to hold their feet to the fire.